Okay, let's get rolling. And I would encourage you, as has been noted in the chat, before I get started, if you have questions that you would like me to address at the end, feel free to submit them via the Q&A, and I will be happy to answer them. So let's get started. This session is Tech is for Everyone, Basics of Online Accessibility. Let me introduce myself to you. My name is Jason Lefkowitz. I'm the president of Rogue Repairman Productions, LLC, located in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. We're a consultancy that provides progressive advocacy and political and nonprofit groups with technical online publishing support. One of my clients is Netroots Nation, and so I'm very pleased to be here to talk to you a little bit about this topic. About me, I've been building websites and web applications since 1995. And so I've watched this medium grow up and learned a lot along the way, and I'm happy to have the chance to share some of it with you, especially on this issue of accessibility, which I think is one that doesn't get the attention it really deserves. And that's too bad. So hopefully you'll come away from this. My goal is to send you away from this presentation, first off, with an appreciation of what accessibility is and how to think about it in your own projects. And second, with some practical tips on things to do and not to do, places to look for further assistance, and ways to audit yourself to make sure that your projects are accessible, or at least as accessible as they can be. Couple of caveats before I begin. Accessibility as a topic is way too big for one session of this length. So this is going to be sort of a 10,000-foot view of the subject of accessibility. You're going to get a grounding in the basics, but there is a lot to learn beyond that. And I would encourage you, if this sounds interesting to you, if you come away from this wanting to know more, there is a whole world out there that you can of best practices and things you can learn how to do. So this is the beginning of your journey, not the end. And the other thing I would say is that as I mentioned before, I'm a web developer, but accessibility is something that is important in the context of all kinds of software. What I talk to you about is going to be from the perspective of a web developer. So if you primarily develop things that are like web applications or videos, this may or may not be as useful to you. Again, my hope is to give you some solid basic principles that are useful regardless of the medium you're working in. Okay, so let's start with a very basic question, which is, what is accessibility? When we use this word, what do we mean by it? And the definition I like to use is, accessibility is the practice of making software usable by as many people as possible. And that means, you know, the world is bigger than a lot of us realize in our day-to-day, and people come in all shapes and sizes and with all sorts of different physical configurations, and we want to make sure that we're making things that turn away as few people as possible just because they can't use it. And so that's what's top of mind for us. And when we talk about making software, software is a huge I mean, so much of the world is software these days, and we're talking about things like websites, we're talking about things like web applications, we're talking about desktop applications, we're talking about mobile applications. As I mentioned before, my focus is mostly going to be on web development, but it's important to recognize that we all spend more and more of our daily life interacting with software. And so if that software is not designed to be inclusive and accessible, then what that means is we're sort of marginalizing people. We're locking them out of these services and tools that are increasingly required to participate in the modern world. So one of the things about, one of the things to understand about this is that software, we all like to think about software as this sort of purely mental thing that exists in the ether and the cloud, or it's just a bunch of bits. But it's important to recognize that human beings, the connection between human beings and software is a physical interface. In order to, the software presents you with tools, buttons, levers you can operate, but in order to operate them, it all has to connect up somehow with your physical self. And this is true both for getting information into an information system and then getting results out of it. When we talk about getting information into it, there has to be a set of inputs, and the technology has come far enough now that we have a pretty well-established set of default inputs for information systems. Things like a keyboard, things like a mouse, things like a touchscreen, things like a voice control system. These are all ways for you to pass instructions or data into an information system, and then that system does something with it, and it brings it back to you results. And those results are presented as text or images or audio or video, but all of those things, in order to make use of them, you have to use your physical senses. You have to use your eyes, you have to use your ears. In some cases, there may be, there may be, for example, in a video game system, you might have a force feedback system where you hold a controller and it rumbles or something. That is an example of an output that, if you can't feel the rumble, then you don't know, you're not getting that information. So that is a physical interface at the end of the day. And the key thing to understand is that people have differing levels of physical ability. So to give you an example, if we look at the data for visual acuity, like your ability to see, there is, as of 2010, in the United States, there were 1.3 million people who are legally blind. But then beyond that, there were 2.9 million people who have what's called low vision, which is to say they're not blind, but they have some degree of reduced visual acuity. If you go beyond that, say, well, let's talk about people with cataracts. There's 24 million of those. And then you'd say, well, what about people with myopia and nearsightedness? There's 34 million of those. And these are all of these are people who have challenges with seeing, with using their eyes as an interface to the world. But the challenge is in different degrees, right? Obviously, the most profound challenge is going to be faced by somebody who's completely blind, but that's not to say that there aren't a long tail of people with with less profound challenges as well. I mean, I'm one of them. I have to wear glasses to read text off of a computer screen. So, we don't normally think about someone like me when we talk about the disabled, right? We tend to push people out into, to take the people who have the most profound disabilities and sort of push them off into one corner and categorize them as something special, whereas there's all these other people with less profound versions of the same disability who are just sort of, as a glasses wearer, most people would not classify me as disabled, but I have an ability challenge. I have reduced visual acuity. So the first thing I would want to get across in terms of thinking about designing accessible systems is don't think about it as something you're doing to appease a tiny population of quote unquote the disabled, right? Because the world is full of people who have varying levels of physical challenges. And when you include all the people for whom the challenge is less, but it's still present, the numbers get really large. And so you're really not talking about, okay, this is something we have to do to appease a tiny minority of people. This is something we're doing to produce a system that can be used by the most people, by people all across that spectrum, from people who have perfect use of that physical facility all the way to people who have complete disuse of that physical facility. And there's a huge continuum in there in the middle, and we want to make sure we're building things that all of those people can access. And that's what accessibility as a design approach is about. So when we talk about disability, it's important to recognize that there are disabilities that sort of jump to mind when people talk about this subject, but then there are also others that are less sort of commonly appreciated, and they're all important. And I want to sort of run down the major categories right now. Like the first one is visual disability. And this is the one, if I pull someone off the street or out of a Netroots Nation panel and I say, tell me what accessibility is about, it will never cease to amaze me how many people say it's about blind people. This is the one that we tend to think of the most as sort of the primary example of what accessibility is for. But as I just went through, when we're talking about visual disabilities, we're not just talking about blind people. We're talking about people with all sorts of different types of visual challenges, including things like color blindness, which I'll get into in a little bit. So that's the first category. But then there's other things like auditory disability, people who have trouble hearing. You can be talking here about people who are deaf or people who are hard of hearing. And when you talk about hard of hearing, that can go anywhere from a really profound inability to hear all the way to just you miss the occasional word. And that's another group of people that we want to make sure have access to these systems that we're building. Another one, and this one that is even less talked about, but it's pretty significant, is people who have challenges with motor skills or physical, the use of the hands particularly. Because so many of the interfaces, the physical interfaces to information systems that we have settled on are driven by the hands. The keyboard, the mouse, the touch screen, these all have an assumption built into them that you have a baseline level of dexterity with your hands. And for a lot of people, that's not the case. In some cases, it can just be a matter of getting older. In other cases, it can be like, for example, I'll use myself as an example again. As someone who has been programming computers for 25 years, I have a mild case of repetitive stress injury, where my wrists are, I get pain in my wrist unless I use accessibility, unless I use hardware like an ergonomic keyboard and that's got a mouse pointer built into it. Those things help me be able to do things that I used to be able to do with any plain $5 keyboard. Now, if I use those cheap tools, it gets painful. And beyond that, you have people who have all the way out to people who are dealing with things like Parkinson's disease or other conditions that reduce their control over their extremities. And we want to make sure that those people are not cut out either. And so one of the things we'll talk about is how can you design an information system to an interface that is easier for folks with motor skills challenges to interact with. Another thing that is a common type of disability is speech problems. And this is in the past, it hasn't really been a big issue for people who are designing information systems, but it's starting to become one just because more and more interfaces are moving to a speech. When you think about tools like Siri and Alexa and Cortana, and we're sort of moving more and more of the way people interface with the systems we build to a speech interface. And that's sort of an emerging category of, okay, this is something we need to think about from an accessibility perspective. If the only way you can use the system is by speech, what does that mean if you have some disability that prevents you from speaking as, that slurs your speech or makes you stutter, or maybe some other thing that prevents you from talking in the sort of routine, normalized way that computers prefer. And then the last one are cognitive and learning disabilities. And that's a subject that is a specialization that's sort of on its own, because at that level, you're talking about really specialized support for folks. And we're not going to talk about that a lot here, but if you're interested in it, I would encourage you to Google around on the subject of accessibility for cognitive deficits or learning disabilities, because it's a whole subsection of this topic that is fascinating. If your sort of attitude coming into it is, okay, what can I do to enable these people, to give them access to the same tools that people without these disabilities have? So one way that we've traditionally dealt with disabilities of all types is to develop what's called assistive technology. And again, like a very simple example of assistive technology is a pair of glasses, right? I have vision problems, so I wear the glasses and now I can read what's on my screen. If I take off the glasses, it would be much harder for me to read that. And we've taken the same sort of philosophy and brought it along into the digital world with the development of tools that people with disabilities can use to make use of the same systems that everybody else does. These are tools like screen readers, which are just software that will read the contents of a document or a web page aloud, so you don't have to read it with your eyes, you could hear it with your ears. Screen magnifiers, which a lot of operating systems have built in now. If you have difficulty making out detail, if you've got reduced visual acuity, a screen magnifier can let you sort of zoom into a particular part of the screen and see it close up. Then there's more esoteric stuff, like there are Braille displays, which instead of reading the contents of a document or a web page out to you, they can actually present it to you in a Braille interface that you can read with your hands. And then alternative input devices can be things like that ergonomic keyboard I was talking about before, or a trackball or a tracking stick instead of a mouse, or an eye tracking, a head-mounted eye tracking unit, so you can move the cursor by looking at different parts of the screen, that sort of thing. But assistive technology is not a 100% silver bullet solution. And the reason for that is because assistive technology requires, in order to function, it requires that you sort of build your stuff in ways that that technology can work with. Like a classic example of this is screen readers. The more, the screen reader has to have some way to figure out what in this page is actual content, and then what is the Chrome around that content, so that it doesn't read you a bunch of navigation links before you get to the actual body of the article, or that sort of thing. And so if you can't push all of the responsibility for interacting with your system onto the user and tell them, go ahead, we're going to build what we want to build, and it's your job to stock up on enough assistive technology to figure out how to make it work for you. It's better if you start off with the perspective that, how can I make this work for as many people as possible? And then, then you can minimize the amount of assistive technology that's required, and the assistive technology that people do bring with them will work better. So what you want, it becomes imperative, if you're interested in this subject, you want to think in terms of designing for accessibility. So let's talk about this from a practical perspective now. What are the, let's take some things that people, some common challenges and common assistive technologies that people use to overcome those challenges, and figure out from a design perspective, how can we help them? How can we work with them to make our system maximally usable? And the first example is the one I'm going to go with, because this is the one most people think of when we talk about accessibility, which is screen readers. So much of what we do, so much of what information systems do now is it revolves around presenting information to a user via a screen. And that is great if you are a user who has complete, fully acute vision. But if you're visually impaired or you're blind, the more profound that disability you have, the harder it becomes to interact with an information system that comes in with the assumption that the way you're going to interface with it is through your eyes. So a tool that a lot of people, a very common tool that a lot of people with who are visually impaired will use to assist them, is a tool called a screen reader. It's just a piece of software that sits in the background, and as you do something like browse around through the web or open a document, it will read the contents of that document or read the contents of that web page aloud to you. So instead of having to get the information through your eyes, you can get the information through your ears instead. And we want to make it, because that's such a common tool, we want to make sure that we design stuff that works with screen readers as easily as possible. We don't want to put barriers up that if someone comes to us with a screen reader, we want to make we want to let them make use of it as fully as they possibly can. And so we want to design software that works well with a screen reader. Now, how do you do that? There's a few things you can do, and again, I'm going to talk about this mostly from the perspective of a web developer. There's a few things you can do to make it easy for someone to interact with your system using a screen reader. The first one is, when you're building your web pages, you want to, as much as possible, use what's called Semantic HTML. And that just means the source code of the page. This should be structured logically. You want your paragraphs wrapped in p tags. You want your headers wrapped in h1, h2, h3 tags. You want those things ordered so that the very first header, the title of the page, is an h1, and the subheaders underneath that are h2s, and then underneath each of those there are h3s, so that lets the screen reader take the document and build it out into a tree, which it can then let the user navigate through. Navigate through the same way someone without a screen reader would navigate through it, by clicking links. Only the way the screen reader does it is that it lets you jump from link to link using, for example, the tab key on a keyboard or some other kind of input device, and it reads each link to you and lets you know, okay, what happens if I'm going to click this link? Where am I going to go? And so the first thing is, you want to have a nice, clean, semantic structure to your web pages. And that is one of those things that a lot of people, especially if you're using sort of automated page building tools, it can get complicated. But that's a great example of, if your page building tool can't build a semantic web page, the question isn't, why should I build a semantic web page? The question is, why am I using a tool that can't do that? Because that's sort of table stakes, in my opinion. So the next thing to think of is, once you've got your document, nice clean HTML document, you want to break it up using what's called sectioning tags, which one of the things, here's a common problem that screen readers run into with web pages. It's very common for a website to have at the top of the page a navigation bar, and then the actual content is underneath it, right? And one of the challenges for a screen reader is, if it's going to read the entire page to you, you don't want it to read the contents of the nav bar out in entirety before the user hears the actual content of the page. The nav bar is something the user is only interested in when they want to navigate. At the beginning, when they first come to the page, what they're interested in is, what is the content? Take me to the content. And the screen reader needs to have some way to know how to do this. And you can provide those cues for screen readers in two different ways. The first one is using a standard called ARIA, A-R-I-A, which lets you add special attributes to different sections of the page that will tell a screen reader or other assistive device, okay, this is a nav bar, this is a header, this is a footer, this is the main content of the page. And if you provide that, then the screen reader can say, oh, and here's the main content of the page, I'm just going to jump to that. And if the user wants the nav bar, they can ask me for it, and I'll take them there, because it knows where the nav bar is too. But the assumption is always going to be, the first thing you want is the content. And ARIA landmarks, or ARIA tags in general, is a very powerful system, but it has the downside of also being kind of complicated. You have to learn this whole vocabulary of how to mark up your document. And so with the emergence of the latest version of HTML, HTML5, some of the most commonly used ARIA landmarks have been merged into HTML itself. And you've been given simple tags you can use that automatically provide the same knowledge to the screen reader about the structure of a document that the more complicated ARIA versions do. So for example, there is now a nav tag. And if you have nav bars anywhere on a page, you can just wrap them inside nav tags, and the screen reader will know, oh, this is navigation. I only should come to it if the user asks me to come to it. If you've got a header or a footer, you can put those inside header tags and footer tags, and the screen reader will know this is not the main content. Inside the main content, you can have the main tag, which says this is the main content, this is where you want to start. And then inside there, you can break it up with things like asides and sections. And you can get really sophisticated with how you build it out. But the key thing about the HTML5 version of it is semantically, or rather, it's much easier to learn than ARIA tags are. So I generally tell people HTML5 is supported everywhere across all browsers. I generally tell people start with the HTML5 sectioning tags. And if there may be cases where they don't do something that you want to do. They don't enable some feature that you want to enable. And in that case, ARIA is a great resource to go to then. But in a lot of cases, especially for the types of websites that those of us in this community tend to build, which is to say mostly informational sites rather than full out web applications, HTML5 sectioning tags are all you need to know. And they will be a huge boon to anybody who is coming to your site with a screen reader. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are sometimes going to be bits of content in your site that are presented in a purely visual fashion. Things like images, things like embedded videos. And for these things, you want to provide a text alternative, because a screen reader, if it's just presented with an image, the screen reader has no idea what to read to the user to describe that image. And so the way you can provide that, you can tell the screen reader what to read, is you put an alt tag on that image that says, and then a short description of the image, and that is what whatever you put for that description, that is what will be read out to the user when they hit that image. Some of you, for example, if you're a heavy user of Twitter, you may notice that Twitter recently added something that accessibility advocates have been begging them to add since Twitter was founded, which is an easy way when you upload an image to post via Twitter to provide an alt tag for it. And that was a really big thing. I'm glad they did that. I don't know if Facebook has done the same thing. I would encourage them to do it if they haven't. And if you're posting images on Twitter, it only takes a second to add an alt tag to it. They give you an interface. You just click the button that says alt and you type in your description. And just by taking that little extra bit of work, you can make your content that much more accessible to people who are coming to you with this assistive technology. For things like audio, video, it gets more complicated. We'll talk about those in a second. The other thing I would say about screen readers is when you put a link into a page, you want to make sure that link has a descriptive label. And the label is just the text that's inside the link, right? The text that you actually click on to follow that link. And the reason for that is because the screen reader will generally go through, one of the things a screen reader will do is it will let the user request an index of all the links in the document. And it will read them out to you one by one. And when you get to the one you want to follow, you push a button and it follows the link, right? So it's important, therefore, that each link have a descriptive label on it that tells you where it's going to take you, so that the user knows when they hit that button where they're going. And this is why one of the bits of lore that has been handed down for these many years about accessibility is don't use what's called the read more link, right? Where you have 50 links in your document and each one of them says read more. And the reason for that is that is actually a good bit of advice. The reason for that is because if you do that, when a user with a screen reader has their document read out to them and they ask for that index of links, it's just going to read the words read more, read more, read more, completely without any context of the text around it that says what they are going to. I'm getting a note that Facebook has added an alt text image. Good for you guys. Good work. So so the thing to do is you want your link, the text of your link should be descriptive enough that someone would have a good sense of where they were going if that was the only context they had, the words on the link. And so this is one of the things I can instantly tell when I look at a website and I see a bunch of links that all say read more, that nobody in the room when that website was built either knew about accessibility or cared about it. Because it's like, it's one of those things that if you understand this stuff, you realize how annoying that makes a website for somebody who is using a screen reader. But a lot of times, unless there's somebody in the room when that site is built that understands this stuff, you know, somebody will say, oh, let's just make all the links say read more, and everyone goes, okay. And so that's why it's important that there be advocates for accessibility in those rooms. And in a lot of cases, that's good. If you're here, then guess what? That advocate is you, or it can be you, it should be you. And you don't have to be, you're not taking on a lifelong challenge. It's just, you can be the person who speaks up and says, no, 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 that's not the way to do it. And so that's something to keep in mind, is watch your text labels on your links. Let's talk about another visual challenge that people have with a lot of websites, which is legibility. In other words, can you actually read the text? Even if you have use of your eyes, can you read the text that's presented? And it is constantly surprising to me how often websites fail this test. Even for someone like me who has a relatively mild problem with my eyes, it's still a huge problem, because you see a lot of websites that have, for example, very tiny font sizes. And if you have to squint, you know, it becomes hard to read. That's not great information design, even for sighted people, much less for people who have visual acuity problems. And so one thing you want to keep in mind is you want to try and stay away from those tiny, tiny font sizes, which can be a challenge just because, having worked with a lot of graphic designers in my career, I have found that designers love tiny font sizes. And so oftentimes it's my role in the process to be the one who says, yeah, but that's going to be really hard to read. And the designer says, well, that's not what I'm here to worry about. I'm here to worry about the art, you know? And so from my perspective, an information system is ultimately a functional object. And a functional object should be designed with an eye more towards its functional use versus something that's entirely decorative, like a painting or something. And if you're interested in that distinction, I would highly recommend, there's a great classic book on this subject called The Design of Everyday Things by a fellow named Don Norman, who worked at Apple for a long time, that goes into this subject in great, great detail. And so I would highly recommend you to seek out that book if you're at all interested in this question of how do you build things that are actually usable by human beings. That's a classic text. The other thing to think about when you're designing for legibility is contrast. Another thing designers love to do is to put white text on a gray background, or black text on a dark gray background. And the problem is, if the color of the background text is too close to the color of the foreground text, if the color of the background is too close to the color of the actual text, rather, I should say, then what happens is you can't read it, or you have to put in a lot of work to read it. And this is actually something I'm seeing in the comments that some folks are posting some great tools to check on this stuff. This is a problem that you can actually quantify mathematically. There are tools that you can put in two colors, and it will tell you the ratio of contrast between those two colors. And the rule of thumb is, for body text, in other words, the small text that makes up most of the page, you generally want a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. And for larger text, you can be a little less contrasty because the size of the text makes it a little more legible. You can go back to 3 to 1. But in either of those cases, if you put the color of the text and then the color of the background into a contrast checker, and they come out with less than that ratio, that's an accessibility problem. And you want to go back and resolve it. And usually resolving it just means, tweaking the colors. And it's easiest if you work with designers who appreciate this stuff going in, so that they're not going to present you with something that is not particularly contrasty, and then you have to go back and forth to make it contrasty. It's better if they come to you with something that has an appropriate level of contrast right from the beginning. But if you can go to these, I should say these ratios, these come from the W3C, the standards committee that forms that makes the rules for what constitutes valid HTML. So this is not like I didn't pull these numbers out of the air. These are hard numbers. And if you go to a contrast checker and you put colors that your designer gave you and they come back with less contrast than this, it's completely valid to go back to them and say, this is a design problem. This needs fixing. And I'm seeing another comment in the comment thread that says there's also the issue of text on an image. That's a good point too. If you're gonna put text into a document, make it actual text. Don't make it an image of text, because again, now you have the problem of with screen readers. If it's text, the screen reader can just read it. If it's an image, now you have to go to extra lengths in order to tell the screen reader what to read when they hit that. That's less common today than it used to be, just because now we have things like web fonts that let you really format your text, actual text, in very precise, very attractive ways that you, in the past, the only way you could have gotten that was by making an image of the text in Photoshop or Illustrator or something like that. So as the web platform has caught up with formatting, there's less and less reason to use those text in an image. And nowadays, I would say there's practically I can't think of a good reason to do that, except that some folks are just sort of stuck in their ways. So that's, again, something you would want to push back on. Let's talk about assisting the colorblind. And even if your vision in terms of the sharpness of it is very good, you can still be colorblind. And color blindness comes in a variety of different flavors, which is too big of a subject to go into in a short talk like this. But the key takeaway that you should have in terms of assisting the colorblind is important information should never be communicated to the user solely through color, because the user might not be able to see that color. And if they can't see the color, they're going to miss the information. So a good example of a usable design in the real world that deals with this is a traffic light. We think of the traffic light in terms of presenting information about whether you should stop or yield or go based on the color of the light. And that's true. But the traffic light is still usable even if you can't distinguish the colors, because you can learn that the top light means stop, the middle light means yield, the bottom light means go. And so this is a great example of an everyday object that is designed. It uses color to accentuate the message, but the color is not the only channel the message is being communicated in. And in practical terms, one way that this often crops up is you see a lot of designs where the only thing that distinguishes a link from the surrounding text is that the link is in a different color. And by default, web browsers put every link with a little underline underneath it. But that's something designers can turn off, and they frequently do, because the argument is it looks nicer. And the counter argument to that is, yes, it looks nicer, but if you can't distinguish the color of that link label from the color of the surrounding text, you're not going to have any idea that there's a link there. And so the underline provides a fallback mechanism so that even if the color isn't communicating the information that this is a link, the underline will as well. And that's one of the things that I try to, when I talk about this subject with designers, is I try to get across is that the underline on the link is not there for no reason. It's providing a useful function. And you should only turn it off if you have a really good reason to turn it off, which is rare. Sometimes it does occur, but if the designer's not used to thinking in terms of accessibility, they're just going to see that underline and think, I don't like the underline, it goes. And it's like, no, this is actually a useful tool for users. And you want to think really hard before you start taking useful tools and throwing them away. Moving beyond things about text, we can talk about audiovisual content, which is like, for example, this talk, which is being recorded and transcribed. More and more online content is presented not as text, but in an audiovisual format. You think of videos, you think of podcasts, things like that. And where there is no text version by default, it's just the audiovisual content. And that is a problem for people who are hearing impaired, or in terms of audio content, people who are visually impaired in terms of video content. because they are sort of cut out. They can't appreciate that unless additional effort is taken to open it up to them. And so if you're going to be publishing video content, or if you're going to be publishing up video or audio content, one of the things you want to think about if you're coming to this from an accessibility perspective is how can you, if we're going to be doing this, we want to provide a transcript. Okay, we want to provide a text version so that if the user can't see the video, or I'm learning so many things that are possible, even when site designers could say that, yes, you could. Yes, that is exactly right. Is that the web designer, I speak as a web designer myself, don't ever take "we can't do that" for an answer. Usually what that means is it would take extra work and we don't want to do it. And that always raises my hackles a little bit, because it's like, okay, great. You know, if you want to look someone in the eye who's got a physical disability and tell them, well, you know, I could help you, but you know, I'm too lazy. Forget it. So provide a transcript. That's a great way to make your audio-visual content accessible. Also, for videos, a lot of video publishing platforms give you the option to provide captioning, like YouTube does. I'm pretty sure other video options do as well. And the nice thing about closed captioning systems, which is most captioning systems, is that they make the captions optional. If the user wants them, they can have them. If the user doesn't want them, they don't have to have them. And you don't have to be deaf to want closed captions. I had, for example, I have an ex-girlfriend who was on a plane once, and due to a pressure imbalance in the cockpit, one of her eardrums burst, right? And ever since then, she has wanted to, whenever she watches TV or watches movies, she turns on the closed captions because it makes it more accessible to her. She doesn't have to work as hard to understand what's going on. And that, nobody would look to her, nobody would look at her and say, oh, she's deaf. She's not deaf. But the captions make the content more accessible. She doesn't have to work so hard. And that's just such an obvious thing you can do. I'm always amazed at how few people actually do it. So captions are great, transcripts are great. Another thing to keep in mind is we talked about people with motor skill issues, and the way that this usually manifests in terms of problems with accessibility are, one of the things I like to do when I test a site for accessibility is, can I navigate through this website without taking my hands off the keyboard? You should be able to. The web browser supports what's called tab navigation, where if you are on a page and you start hitting the tab key on your keyboard, it will automatically jump from link to link in the document. And ideally, it will jump from link to link in a logical order, so that it starts with the first link on the page, then the second, then the third, then the fourth. In other words, it's not, the cursor isn't jumping all around. And even better, that tab order is something that is configurable. You can set it when you design the page. So if you want to have it so that, for example, if the top thing is navigation and you don't want the user to have to tab through 20 navigation items to get to the actual links in the content, you can set the links in the content to be first in what's called the tab order, and then put the navigation items last. And then when the user hits tab, they will go straight to the first item in the content, go all the way through the content, and then they'll loop around to the navigation. That is a super easy way to tell, like, you know, is this something that was designed with accessibility in mind? Because one of the things that is, when we talk about a mouse as a pointing device, the question, can we have these slides? Yes, absolutely. I will be happy to distribute copies of this presentation to anybody who needs it afterward. I'll give you, at the end of the presentation, I'll have my contact info. So one thing, the thing about a mouse is that a mouse really relies on very fine, precise motor skills, right? And if you don't have those motor skills, if your hand shakes, or if you know, then the mouse is useless to you. And so you don't want to design only around the mouse. Other things to avoid are interactive elements that are based on timing, i.e. you don't want to have a button that's visible and then it vanishes, and then it comes back and it vanishes, and then the user has to click the button when it's there, or else nothing happens. Or buttons that move around the page. Like, this is bad. You don't want you don't want to make it, you're not building a video game. you want to build something that is easily usable. And so anything that's interactive should be stable and always present. And then the last one, especially when we're talking about touchscreens, is you want to provide a generous, what they call a tap target, which is the amount of space around the tap, the amount of space that you provide that will register as a click for each image should be nice and big, because as opposed to the mouse, which is a very precise pointing mechanism, your finger is a big chunky pointing mechanism. And it's real easy to miss by a few pixels when you're trying to tap something. So if you're going to provide a link, you can generally do things like you can use CSS styling to blow out the padding around that, and the whole thing will still count as a link. But if they tap a few pixels above the link or below it, it will still register as a tap. Very useful for mobile. How to get accessibility, quote unquote, for free. And one thing that many people don't realize is platform vendors, by which I mean the people who make operating systems, devices, things like web browsers, things like that, they put a lot of work into making sure that the standard tools that come with that platform are accessible. So for example, in the web context, we're talking here about, like, let's say you were building a form that has elements like a drop-down menu, right? There is a way in HTML to provide a drop-down menu. It's called the select tag. And if you use a select tag, that select tag is going to, because it's a standard widget, that part of the web specification, part of what makes a web standard. That widget is going to the vendors have put work into making sure that that widget is going to be accessible without you having to do anything. It's automatically going to get dropped into the tab order. If the user hits the down arrow on the keyboard, the menu will automatically expand. They can keep hitting down arrow to choose. It will be accessible to screen readers. They do a lot of work to give you all that, and you don't have to do anything just by using the standard widget. But now, especially with the rise of JavaScript and tools like React, there's a big trend in web design these days to build your own custom widgets. And the downside to custom widgets is nobody has done that accessibility work for them. You have to do it. And if you don't do it, it won't get done. So if you're going to build in custom widgets, you want to be really sure, and this is a great thing to push back on the vendors if you're buying tools from people that create these widgets, you can push back on them and say, hey, tell me about the accessibility story around this product you made. And show me a demo, and I will tab through and see if the tab key works, see if it shows up in the tab order, that sort of thing. And if their answer is accessibility, what's that? Take your money elsewhere. Like that's because if you're using those tools, you're automatically cutting out a part of your audience, which is not great. So the last thing I would say is the perspective that I'm advocating here has a name. It's called universal design. And universal design says that it's better to build something with accessibility as a priority from the start than it is, and I say better, it's also cheaper and easier if you think about this stuff from the start, instead of building something and then going back later and being like, oh, how do we make this accessible, right? I think about when I was an undergrad, the buildings in my college went back 100 years. And there was a lot of work going on when I was an undergrad to bring them into compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, I should say. And so you had these stone buildings that had scaffolding all around them to provide ramps and, because they had not been designed with this stuff in mind. And that an awful lot of money and effort was expended to take these buildings that had not been designed from the start to be accessible and make them accessible. But if they had had somebody in the room to talk about, like, hey, how do I get up these stairs if I'm in a wheelchair? How do I get up these stairs if I'm on crutches? They could have saved a lot of that time and money, right? So build this into you from the start. And it's important to remember when you're advocating to accessibility, like I said before, this is not a small population. Accessibility is about everybody. And there's even a term for this, what they call the curb cut effect, which is, when people started putting cuts into curbs to do things like let you roll a wheelchair up them. That was explicitly first conceived as a measure for accessibility, to help people who are in wheelchairs get up onto the curb. But over time, it became useful for all sorts of people. Like, you know, you can take a shopping cart and roll it up there onto the curb just as easily as you can take a wheelchair. And so over time, curb cuts have become something that are just understood as beneficial to everybody. And that's really what we're aiming for here, is we want to make accessibility so pervasive and so obvious that it's just part of the everyday scenery when we're building software. Places to start, if you want to look at your accessibility of your products, your services, your websites, there's a lot of professional firms that can do a full-up usability audit, but a great sort of quick and dirty tool that I like to recommend to people is something called Google Lighthouse, which is actually built into the Chrome browser. If you go into the developer tools, one of the things you can do there is there's a button that says Lighthouse, and you can run, if whatever page you happen to be looking at, if you hit that button, it will generate an accessibility report of the page that you're looking at. And so this is a great way if you're like, where can, and not just a report that shows you like broad things, but it'll actually list like specific concrete things that you need to fix. And this is a great way if you want to get started, is go take a page that you're responsible for and run it through Lighthouse and see what score you come back with. I guarantee it will be low, because unless you started this thing unless you started with this line of thought from the beginning, odds are it wasn't a priority in building it. But it will tell you, if you fix this, here's what it'll go up. And if you fix this, here's how it'll go up. And so you have a concrete list of things that you can do. It's not a substitute for a full-up audit, because there's some things that can only be flagged by, they're sort of subjective, and so they can only be flagged by human testers. But it's a great way, without spending a dime, to immediately flag the big problems with your web pages and figure out what to do with them. In terms of standards, there are a couple of standards that are most common for accessibility. If you're building something for the US government, it's going to have to be compliant with which standard called Section 508, which is just the US government's standards for accessible technology. There's a more general standard from the World Wide Web Consortium, which are the people who decide what the web is, the standards committee, called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. And I'm not here to tell you that you should throw away everything you have that doesn't meet one of these standards. But if you look up either of these, they can provide you with a great starting point to audit your tools and figure out, like, what are the things we need to fix? What are the things we can fix? And then if you actually get to a point where you are regularly meeting these standards, that's a feather. That's something you can feel good about. So that's it. That's my presentation. Again, my name's Jason Lefkowitz. I'm the president of Rogue Repairman Productions in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. If you have questions about this or would like a copy of the slides, feel free to send me an email at jason@roguerepairman.com. Check the spelling on that, just because I've had an awful lot of people, I found out later, tried to email me, but they were actually emailing it to rougerepairman.com, which is not my domain. I am Rogue, R-O-G-U-E. So hope this is useful. Look forward to hearing from you if you have questions or want to get a copy of the slides, or otherwise take it forward. Thanks so much for your time. And I should say too, there were no questions in the Q&A. I hope that means that I'm like a great presenter. But if you have questions that come to mind afterwards, you've got my email address. Feel free to reach out.